There was a moment in your life when you understood for the very first time that you were going to die. Not as a concept, not as a word someone used, as a fact about you specifically. You were going to stop existing, and nothing was ever going to bring you back. You probably remember exactly where you were, how old you were, what the light looked like in the room, because that moment does not leave you. It lands somewhere deep and stays there forever. Now, here is the thing nobody has ever asked. When did that happen to our species for the very first time? Not to you, not to your parents, not to anyone in recorded history. To the first human being who ever sat with that thought, the first mind in the history of life on Earth that looked at the world around them and understood with complete clarity that they were going to disappear from it. That moment happened. It was real. It happened to a specific individual in a specific place at a specific time. And what happened inside that person's brain when it did is one of the most extraordinary things science has ever uncovered. But before we get there, you need to understand something about every other animal alive. They do not know they are going to die. Not in the way you do. A gazelle being chased by a lion is terrified. Its heart is hammering. Every muscle in its body is screaming, "Run!" But that terror is immediate. It is about right now. The moment the lion gives up the chase, the gazelle stops running. It lowers its head. It starts grazing again. Within minutes, the fear is completely gone. Not suppressed, not hidden. Gone. Because the gazelle has no concept of its own future death. It only knows the threat that is directly in front of it right now. You are different. You can be sitting in a completely safe room with nothing threatening you in any direction and still feel the weight of your own mortality pressing down on you. That is not animal fear. That is something else entirely. Something that required a specific cognitive leap that no other creature on Earth has ever made. Researchers call it mortality salience. The awareness that you specifically, not just things around you, but you, will one day cease to exist. And according to evolutionary anthropologist Thomas Suddendorf at the University of Queensland, this awareness requires two cognitive abilities that are unique to humans. The first is the ability to mentally travel through time, to project yourself into the future, and imagine scenarios that have not happened yet. The second is the ability to understand that you yourself are a being with a limited lifespan. Without both of these working together simultaneously, mortality awareness is impossible. No animal on Earth possesses both. And your ancestors did not always possess both either. Here's where it gets genuinely strange. For millions of years, your ancestors lived and died without knowing they were going to die. They grieved. There is evidence of that. They felt loss when members of their group disappeared. Neanderthal burial sites discovered across Europe and the Middle East show that our closest ancient relatives were carefully placing bodies in the ground, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with tools, sometimes with food. Researcher Francesco D'Erico has documented these burial sites extensively and argues that the deliberate placement of objects with the dead represents something profound, an attempt to do something for a being who could no longer respond. That is not random behavior. That is emotion. That is care. But it may not yet have been the full understanding that they themselves were next. The cognitive leap from grieving others to understanding your own death is not a small one. It is not a gradual slide. It is a cliff edge. And the evidence suggests it happened somewhere between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago, during the same explosion of symbolic thinking that produced the first cave art, the first jewelry, the first long-distance trade of objects with no practical value. Researcher Chris Stringer at the Natural History Museum in London has spent decades mapping this cognitive revolution and argues that the emergence of symbolic thought and the awareness of personal mortality were not separate developments. They were the same development. The brain that could create a symbol, that could take a shell and decide it meant something beyond what it physically was also the brain that could look at its own existence and understand it as a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Think about what that means for the first human who experienced it. You are sitting by a fire. It is night. Your group is around you. You have seen people die before, many of them, the old ones, the sick ones, the ones who went hunting and did not come back. You have felt the grief of that, the hollow weight of absence. And then something shifts. Something connects inside your mind that has never connected before. You look at your hands. You look at the fire. You look at the people around you. And for the first time in the history of your species, a thought forms that has never formed in any mind before it. That is going to be me. Not them, me. I am going to disappear the way they disappeared. Nobody told that person what to do with that thought. There was no philosophy. There was no religion. There was no framework for it at all. They were the first. And what they did with it changed everything. Because here is what the archaeological record shows happened almost immediately after this cognitive leap. Humans started making things that were designed to outlast them. Not tools, not weapons, not things with practical survival value. Things with meaning, symbols. marks, art. The handprints on cave walls that we looked at in a previous video, those were not decoration. Researcher Ian Davidson at the University of New England has argued that symbolic marking of this kind is a direct response to mortality awareness. You press your hand to the stone, blow pigment around it, and leave a mark that says, I was here, because something inside you now understands that you will not always be here. The mark is proof against disappearance. The first human attempt to defeat death, not by surviving it, but by leaving something behind that survives instead. And then they built something even more extraordinary. They built explanation, because the knowledge of your own death is not something you can simply sit with and accept. Every human brain that has ever encountered this knowledge has immediately needed to answer one question: what happens after? And the archaeological evidence shows that, almost simultaneously with the emergence of mortality awareness, humans began constructing answers. Burial rituals that placed the dead in specific orientations, facing specific directions, aligned with sunrise or sunset. Grave goods that suggested the dead would need things wherever they were going. Ochre, the red pigment that colored so many ancient burial sites, that researchers like Paul Pettit at Durham University argue was connected symbolically to blood, life, and rebirth. Every ancient culture that has ever existed has had an answer to what happens after death. Not some of them, every single one, without exception, across every continent, in populations with no contact with each other. That universality is not a coincidence. It is a necessity. The human brain created religion, created afterlife belief, created ritual, not because it was superstitious or primitive. It created these things because the alternative, knowing you are going to die and having no answer for what that means, was cognitively unbearable. Your brain needed a story, and so it built one. But here is the part nobody talks about, the part that reaches from that fire, 70,000 years ago, directly into your chest, right now. Every coping mechanism your culture has ever given you for dealing with death, every religion, every philosophy, every belief in legacy or meaning or purpose, every reason you have ever told yourself that your life matters, all of it traces back to that single moment, that single brain sitting by a fire, making a connection that no mind had ever made before. Your entire inner life, the part of you that searches for meaning, the part that fears insignificance, the part that needs to believe that your existence is not pointless, is the direct descendant of that first terrifying thought. The awareness of death is the thing that makes you most human. It is the engine behind every story ever told, every monument ever built, every song ever sung, every mark ever made on any surface, anywhere, by any human being who has ever lived. All of it is a response to that same unbearable knowledge that came to your ancestors in the dark, sitting by a fire, looking at their hands. Tonight, you are going to think about this, maybe for a second, maybe for longer. And when you do, remember that you are not alone in that thought. You never have been. The very first human who ever had it was so overwhelmed by it that they pressed their hand to a stone wall and blew red pigment around it, just to prove they had been here, just to leave something behind. You are still doing the same thing. You just do not always realize it.